Hello, friends. David Vos here. Oh, buddy, look at the snow. Boy, oh boy, it's beautiful, huh? Well, yeah, we got some snow today. A lot more than I thought we would. I heard somebody saying, man, they hadn't had snow around here in a long time. But anyway, it's beautiful. Probably gone in a day or two. But I want to do today's podcast in continuing on with what we've been talking about with Newton's calculations about the end of the world in 2060 and the 1,260 days and the 7 times of Daniel and the beasts that come up and the 7 heads and the 10 horns and all this stuff, the prophecies, the book of Revelation, the apocalypse. Oh, buddy, it's interesting. The 144,000 that gather on Mount Zion. What does all this mean? Okay, well, we're going to find out what it means because there is a way to understand all of this. We've got to find something. I've determined, well, in looking at prophecy, sometimes you'll get somebody who'll say, well, I think this or that. And it makes a little bit of sense. But it doesn't fit with something else that you know is true. So sometimes the way to understand how the Bible is to be understood is to go and find something that's related to what you're trying to understand that you can prove, even if you can't prove or you don't know for sure what Daniel meant or John the Revelator. If you can find there's something in Daniel's writings that you can prove, then you can start there as a foundation. For instance, in order to understand the book of Revelation, sometimes you got to go back to another prophet. So in the book of Daniel, Daniel actually interprets some of the symbols that he gives. So, for instance, in the book of Daniel, he mentions these beasts coming up out of the earth. In one case, he talks about, in Daniel chapter 8, he talks about this he-goat that has a little horn. And then it gets broken and 4 other horns come up instead. And he actually interprets it there in the book of Daniel to mean that the he-goat is the country of Greece. And so scholars, whether it be Jewish scholars for a couple of thousand years, have looked at this. And they have determined that there isn't any other way you can accept or understand that other than Alexander the Great, the Grecian king, who had 4 generals. And when Alexander the Great came up in like 330 BC, his generals came up later on, and one of the generals ended up getting strength and taking his dominion in according to Daniel in the area of the land of declaration, or the land of Palestine, where the temple was. The land of thy people, which is Daniel's people. So we know then that the little horn in that particular verse, Daniel chapter 8, is specifically talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, who went in and slaughtered a pig in the holy place there in Jerusalem. And so there was a small fulfillment of Daniel there. But now you say, well, then that should solve it. We'll just somehow or another, all these these dates, 1,260 days and all of this stuff about the sanctuary being cleansed and the coming of the Lord and the coming of the Messiah. In chapter 9 of Daniel, it mentions a time when the Messiah would arise and the temple would be rebuilt. Should be pretty clear. However, there are so many allusions in the book of Daniel to other things. And you've got to be able to put this all together. Because in the book of Daniel, you have another little horn, but it comes out as an 11th horn. But then he says he saw a ferocious beast. And he doesn't really give a description of it. Well, that's very similar to Revelation, this the beast, right? And this beast, he says, had 10 horns. And another little horn comes up after them. Well, if we know then that that first leopard is Greece, well, in one chapter of Daniel, he calls it a leopard with 4 heads. But in this other one, in Daniel 8, 4 horns, and then one of the little horns that grows towards the land of decoration, but he calls it Greece. So we know that the beast coming after that has to be Rome. Because we've already seen how he talks about Babylon. Well, he says in Daniel in chapter 4, he says, "O thou, O king, are the head of gold." And then in another chapter, we can correlate that, and we can see that the first beast, which was a lion, would be the head of gold, or would correlate or parallel the head of gold. We know that the lion then, the king of kings, was the king of Babylon. So a lot of this that I'm saying is just kind of general. We can't, I'm not going to be able to show you the verses, and because we're doing this so that, you know, you're not seeing the Bible and we're not reading every verse and we're not going through it like that. Because I think a lot of you have a general idea of this. I think I'm talking to people that has gone over this before. Some of you may have seen Ellen White's understanding, or the Millerites, or Jehovah's Witnesses view, or Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You've read books, maybe Hal Lindsey, or other, prophecies. Most people understand a lot of this. 490 years, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people. And most people understand that that is a prophecy from the going forth of the call to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem. It started some have different little dates. Some will say it was 455. Some say it was 457. Some say it was 445 BC. But that the 490 years starts from there and goes unto the coming of Christ, the Messiah. And he will bring in everlasting righteousness and do away with sacrifices. So we kind of have some agreement across the board that the general idea of what Daniel's talking about. And there isn't, the point I'm trying to make here is that this is generally agreed upon, the fact that we're talking about Greece and Babylon and Rome. And if you can agree upon that, then you get to a place where it talks about 10 kings, and we know that it's talking about Rome. Then we know that the only 10 kings it could be possible. I mean, you might argue or disagree about one of the kings, like there were 10 horns. Are they literal horns? They'd have to be, wouldn't they? Because one comes up after the 10, and he uproots 3 of the first horns by the roots. This is the interesting thing about the Bible. You'll have a basic parable or a symbol that means some literal things, and then later on it sort of dwarfs and metamorphosizes into some other spiritual application. See? So that the beast in Daniel is talking about specific government, perhaps. But when it gets to the book of Revelation, now it metamorphosizes into a 7-headed 10-horn beast. See? Because it's kind of conglomerizing everything that we've already said in Daniel. But the point is here that we know that Rome is one of the kingdoms, one of these bestial kingdoms that Daniel talks about and the Revelation talks about. Because Daniel's 10 horns are literal kings that arise, and one would rise afterward and uproot 3 of the first. Now, if you go through those kings that came up after the Roman Empire was established, it's pretty hard to get around the fact that it has to be these various kings that pretty much everybody has agreed to. The Lombards, the Hurlus, the Vandals, the Franks, the Ostrogoths. Basically, you could say is Europe, okay? under the Holy Roman Empire, it sort of centered around Germany. The Holy Roman Empire. So the Holy Roman Empire was made up of all of the kings of Rome. Those 10 kings come up after the arrival of Rome. Then we know that the little horn that comes up after the 10 kings has to be something that comes up after Jesus lived and died in 30 AD or 30 CE, Christ's era. We know that Jesus stood and said to his disciples, look at the buildings of the temple. Not one stone will be left upon a stone. And he said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, let the reader use wisdom. Go back and look at the book of Daniel. I'm talking about prophecy, Jesus is saying. He says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that the desolating of her is near. So now we know that Jesus is specifically telling us. And later he says, this generation, all these things will be fulfilled. So he says, in this generation, Jerusalem will be surrounded by armies, and the Antichrist will enter into Jerusalem, and this abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet. Let the reader use discernment. Let those on the housetops not come down to take a coat out of their house, but flee into the mountains. Woe unto the pregnant woman. He's saying, look, this is going to be a great tribulation. And that, of course, is clear that it happened in 66 or 67 CE, just one generation after Jesus said those words. And by 70 AD, Titus Vespasian came into Jerusalem and wiped them off the face of the earth, and they were eating their own flesh, and they were in famine and starving. They surrounded it, and they held off for 3 years. And they were in the city for 3 years, eating their own. They had nothing to eat, and they were just starving, and it was an excruciating, terrible tribulation. We know that is at least one interpretation of the book of Daniel, of that little horn that comes up. But there's something interesting about this little horn. He has the eyes and the mouth of a human being, of mankind. That Hebrew word is, or that Aramaic word, it means of a human, okay, of one of mankind. Well, the mouth that he has speaks great blasphemies. Titus Vespasian didn't really do something so extraordinary that you would say he's the great Antichrist that spoke the great blasphemies. Because remember, Daniel also describes this king as going against the Prince of Princes. So we find out through various ways that the little horn of Greece, or Antiochus Epiphanes, went in and desecrated the temple, was more like not a complete and final interpretation or fulfillment of this sanctuary being desolated and having to be lying desolate, waiting for its cleansing. This whole prophecy is about God's sanctuary being desolate, and the people being scattered, and the city being trodden underfoot. And it says, Jesus said, in Jerusalem shall be trodden of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles shall be fulfilled. The question is, what exactly are the times of the Gentiles? We know that the times are written in the book of Daniel as a time, times, and a half a time. In other places, 7 times. And the reason for that is because, well, in Daniel 8, the angel comes to Daniel and describes this whole scenario where Antiochus Epiphanes is going to desecrate the temple. And then he says, now, I want to tell you, Daniel, that this vision is until the time of the end. It shall be in the future, in the future. And he says, I'm showing you a vision of all of these kingdoms and these beasts and all these things that they're going to do and how they're going to trample the city of Jerusalem. I'm giving you a specific horn that's going to do some specific thing. I'm talking about the king of the north and the king of the south. It's going to be intricate. It's going to take somebody like Sir Isaac Newton to sit down and for years, he spent many years deciphering and getting into history and determining who this king of the north was at this particular time and who the king of the south was that pushed against him and who that little horn was and who these 10 horns was. And because of all of his wonderful work, we've determined that he's got to be pretty much correct. Because there's like you could argue about whether or not the Lombards was the 7th king or where maybe it was the Herlues or but you can't basically argue that Rome came up and it was the world power and that 10 kings arose from that. And the horn that arose after it with the mouth that spoke blasphemies against the Prince of Princes would be the Pope. And very few people who have studied the book of Daniel and Revelation has come to any conclusion other than that. That the great blasphemer of all history was this Holy Roman Empire that where the Pope declared himself to be God, the Vicar of Christ, and literally then fulfilled the book of Revelation where it talks about the souls underneath the altar that cried out and said, "How long, O Lord?" Because of all of these inquisitions and this death and the threats and the blasphemies and the edicts and the councils and the martyrdoms of all of these people of God. And when you look at the time that Rome or the Holy Roman Empire spent ruling the world, it was more than just 100 years. It was more than a few hundred years. They started, Constantine, who organized this Catholic Church in around 325, if you started it from there and brought it all the way down to the Catholic Church is still going, right? And as we've said in many videos, truly the real power in the earth today is the Pope. He controls all of the kings of the world and always has. So we're talking about quite a while now, over 1,000 years that the Catholic Church has ruled. So we have to determine what it means then that the little horn will be given authority for 1,260 days. Now go back to when Jesus said that the fulfillment of that little horn would be in his own generation, and it would literal 3.5 years pass between 67 AD and 70 AD, and it was fulfilled. But yet that fulfillment didn't encompass all of the prophecies. Only part of them. As we said, the book of Daniel will give a little prophecy that later on in another chapter will expand on that, in the sense that, like, for instance, that some have said that little horn that came out of Greece, one of the generals that came from Greece in Alexander the Great, his 4 generals, it was that particular branch or line of kings that gained authority in the area we call Rome. So basically, that little horn of Greece became Rome. And then, not only then did they desecrate the Holy Temple in 134 BC, as when Antiochus Epiphanes went into the sanctuary and defiled it by sacrificing a pig. Yet that little horn grows up into a beast, which Daniel calls this ferocious beast that then itself grows into a huge beast of its own, not just a horn, but this little horn then somehow is projected down through time on the next kingdom. We know this because Daniel himself in another chapter talks about Rome as another beast, and then he brings up this little horn again. But this time it's the 11th king that comes up after the 10 horns of Europe. And that happened in 800 with the Holy Roman Empire. And he's the one who spoke the blasphemies. So obviously when Christ is looking down and saying, yeah, the Antichrist is going to come in a literal sense, there's going to be 3.5 literal years, he was still not excluding the fact that there would be a much greater fulfillment of that. We don't have to guess because Daniel tells us that there would be another fulfillment. And so then Daniel has all of these different dates and figures. And it can get really confusing for the reasons that we've enumerated, because, and then we've got the Apostle Paul, long after Jesus died and rose again, in his epistle saying, we're still waiting for this man of perdition who will go into the temple of God, declaring he is God. And we've got John, who wrote the book of Revelation in 100 AD, saying the Antichrist is coming and it is the last hour. And this is how you know that it is the last hour, because many Antichrists have gone forth. So you see, there's this great fulfillment that the apostles were still looking forward to. Even the apostle John, after Titus Vespasian entered into Jerusalem, he was still looking forward to the fulfillment. So this is why we know that it's many faceted. All of this prophecy has many facets. And we have to take into consideration the fact that it's layered with literal and then symbolic and then spiritual different interpretations or fulfillments. Well, as we've said, Newton said that the 1,260 days starts when the Pope came up and created the Holy Roman Empire. And that happened in 800. And that would last for 1,260 years, because it's a day for a year in prophecy. And there is, this is given to us, and it's verified many times. For one, the Bible itself tells us that there are times, like in the book of Ezekiel, where, like, Ezekiel lay on his side for 430 days. And he says, I've given you a day for a year. A day for a year is what I've given you. This will represent 430 years. And so, with various reasons, I mean, there's so many. It's obvious that in this 1,260 days can't be just literal days in the greater fulfillment. So, with that in mind, Daniel says that in Daniel 8, he says there's going to be 2,300 evenings and mornings. Newton did not, he said in his writings that he did not know for sure what that meant. Newton had worked out what the 1,260 days would be. He had worked out what the 1,290 days would be, and the 1,335. And it seems that his interpretation is correct, because he was certain enough about those to write down his interpretation. And everybody since that time has looked at it and said, something very close to what he's saying has got to be right. And it's interesting because a lot of people were talking about his interpretation in the early 1800s, and they wouldn't have known how accurate he was. But we're living in the year 2020, and we can look back and see that the Israelites have gone, there was a declaration for them to go back to the land of Palestine. And this happened And since 1948, they've been a nation. And then we look at Newton's prophecy where he says that the 1,290 days would start in 609 and would end in 1944. And we think, wow, I mean, Newton lived in the year 1700, 1690 to 1720. In that area, he was writing his prophetic works. You know, how could he have just guessed that Israel would become a nation and they would go back to their land after the World War II? It's amazing. And so this gives a lot of credence to what he said. In fact, his writings were so amazing and enlightening that people like we said, Miller and the Adventists and later on Jehovah's Witnesses and the Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints have taken these themes and basically they're still understanding most of it the same way that he understood it. But remember, Newton was before Miller. He was before the Adventists. So in the days when Newton was looking at this, he wasn't sure what the 2,300 days meant. All he had worked out for sure, he thought that the 1,260 days would end in 2060. Well, others since that time has taken a look at this 2,300 days, and they've realized something that maybe Newton didn't notice. But the 2,300 evenings and mornings is spoken of in Daniel chapter 8. It says that it would be for the time of the end. The next chapter, in Daniel chapter 9, says, O Daniel, there was a word that went forth in the last chapter, in the last vision that you had when you were praying to me, and you fell sick and you were praying. And I went and I gave you this word. The word was the 2,300 evenings and mornings prophecy. And he says, now I've come to give you more understanding so that you'll know when it starts and when it ends, basically. And he says, let me tell you, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people, which in the Hebrew means it is cut off, separated away. Separated away from what? Cut off from what? Well, he just said, I've come to explain the word that I told you in the last vision concerning the sanctuary, concerning the evenings and mornings, the 2,300. He says, from the going forth of the call to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah, there's going to be 70 weeks. And you know, this gets kind of detailed. He makes a distinction there between the first 7 weeks and 62 weeks and then the last week. But altogether there's 49 or 70 weeks. Now, there's another place that we can be certain that these are days for a year, because the date that Artaxerxes made, which was a declaration for the people to go back and rebuild Jerusalem, happened either in 445 or 454 or 457. Others have different. We don't know the day and the hour, see, because we don't know history well enough to pinpoint it down to the month and the day and the year. There's various ideas. But we don't even know for certain the year Jesus was baptized. There's many, and I'm not in this video going to try and prove that Jesus came in this year and died in that year and everything. I don't think it's important that we get the exact year. Not in this video. We might discuss that in another video. But in this video, all we need to know is that right around the year 30, Jesus died and rose again. Well, probably the year 33 or 34, he was resurrected. And so this means that somewhere around the year 457 to 460, that's probably when this prophecy begins. And it's determined and cut off and separated from the rest of the 2,300 evenings and mornings. If you do that, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints says it comes out to the year 1830. The Adventists say it was 1844. Well, something's very interesting. They took this prophecy of the 2,300 years, starting from 457, and it came out to 1844. And they said, okay, perhaps the world will come to an end. Well, when it didn't come to an end, many of them gave up and, some of them said, and many of the Adventists, and Ellen White said, well, what this actually means is that the sanctuary, which is in heaven, not the one on earth, not that little Jerusalem over there, but the one that's in heaven would be cleansed or made righteous or made correct and right. The word there is Zadok, righteousness, made right. It's translated cleansed in some translations. The sanctuary shall be cleansed or made right. But it really is that word righteousness. So in other words, it's going to come to a good place. Whereas before it had been trampled upon by the nations. It will be, supposedly it's the temple of God, which is the body, right? Our body is the temple of the living God. But at some point, we go from the literal understanding to the spiritual. How is that, and why would that be? Well, as we said, when Jesus was on the earth, all the literal parts were fulfilled in that generation. At that point, the book of Revelation starts explaining all these things over again as if they're going to all happen again, but this time in a very longer and more protracted spiritual way. And we find out that there may be 2 or 3 more different interpretations after that literal one. So, if the 2,300 evenings and mornings, according to many, did end in 1844, it wouldn't necessarily mean the end of the world, would it? It would simply mean that the sanctuary is cleansed. Well, then you look at the book of Revelation, and you see that even after the sanctuary is cleansed, stuff keeps happening. There's more stuff, right? There's the final judgment and all of these things that's got to happen. So just because one date comes out to some specific time that you can figure out doesn't mean that's going to be the end of the world. So what happened in 1844? Well, interestingly enough, the book of Revelation says, the hour of her judgment has come. Babylon is fallen. Babylon is fallen. And the 3 angels went forth. The third angel's message was, Babylon is fallen. The hour of her judgment has come. Note the word hour there. Because, you see, up to now, we've been saying that all these words mean something. Right? I mean, what is it when in the book of Joel or in the book of Amos, where it talks about the day of the Lord? What is the day of the Lord? Well, Joel says the day of the Lord shall be a thick day of darkness and gloom. The book of Amos says, why do you want the day of the Lord? It will not be light, but it'll be a day of darkness. So what day is it talking about? Remember what we said. All this prophecy is talking about an astrological wheel, a timetable. The bottom of the wheel is the night, the top of the wheel is day. And Yahweh's kingdom is at the bottom, in the Abzu. Ea worshipped or ruled in the Abzu, or the abyss. Right? Abaddon, in the book of Revelation chapter 9, is Father Adonai. And this is Yahweh Adonai, who has the key to the abyss because he's got the law, the curses, the death, the accusator that sends us to hell because we've sinned. The lower carnal forces and his dark night. So the day of the Lord Yahweh is not a day of light, but a day of darkness. And you're not supposed to say, oh, we want the day of the Lord, but it will not be light. It will be darkness. So, what is this day of the Lord? Well, as we said, if you take it a day for a year, in this analogy here, we got 1,260 days, which is 1,260 years. It's very interesting because we came up with that by timesing 7 times, or 7 times 7 years, and each year has 360 days. So it's 7 times 360, which comes out to 2,520. And we said that the Sumerians had a longer time that they called a sar, which was 3,600. So 7 of the sars would be 25,200. And that's the length of time that the entire astrological wheel goes all the way around. So that half of the times, the 7 times is 3 times, 3.5, or times and a half a time. See, a time, 2 times, and a half a time, which is 3.5 times, or 42 months. And so the half a time is the darkness, and the half of the other half is the light. And the 7 is all of it. So it's all of it to begin from beginning to end. 25,200 years. That's how long it takes for us to go through the entire astrological chart. Remember, in the greater fulfillment, Daniel's talking about a lion that we said was Babylon, but in the greater fulfillment, he's talking about Leo. And that wasn't, Leo's way over there, just before Virgo. And if each of these houses are 2,000 years, then that's like 16,000 years ago. Why would he start with Leo, right? Is that the beginning of the wheel or something? No. Because you see, in the top of the wheel, the great Atlantis, or the great age of light and God's kingdom, which ruled for thousands of years, aeons ago, in the great days of Atlantis. That was when we were in the top of the wheel, which we're going back into that now, see? But that was when the sun ruled up in Cancer, and then in Leo, and then to Virgo, and then boom, it goes down over the horizon into Libra, into the judgment. So Leo is the head of gold. That was when the kingdom of this world was still proud and great, and the great lion that ruled, right, in his strength and in his pride. But at that point, they go down into the darkness. That's where it all begins to fall and degenerate into, we're still talking about Leo degenerated now into this ferocious kind of cat, like a leopardy swift. Some have said that the leopard with the spots represents the entire sky, the starry sky. Others think that because the lion is the leopard, or the Leo, that the king of all the beasts begins to degenerate down further and further into a bear, which is a carnivorous animal like the lion. But it continues on down until it gets to the ram, which is Aries, in the days of Christ. And it doesn't give us all of the various, it doesn't talk about Scorpios so much. It does in the book of Revelation. It gives the scorpions that come out of the bottomless pit, which would be down in that area. And it talks about the horses, the centaurs, which is Sagittarius, in that part of the realm. So it does mention these in other places of the Bible. And so we can determine that this is what it's talking about. Starting from Leo, going down into Virgo, the house of bread, giving birth to the child who goes down into Egypt, into the lower realms, which goes down into Scorpio and Sagittarius. Not before, that centaur has his bow and he pulls it back and he shoots his arrow and he hits Scorpio, and Scorpio takes his claw, his clipper, and he pinches the sun, and the sun goes out, and Libra goes down over the horizon. And so this is why in Joel it says the day of the Lord, or the day of Yahweh in the darkness. It says the stars shall fall from heaven, the moon won't give, the sun won't give her light, because we're down in the bottom of the wheel. That's the day of the Lord Yahweh in the darkness of night. Why do you want the day of the Lord? It's not light, it's darkness, Joel says. So that's all prophetic of this great dark night. Even in the movies, they're talking about the dark night, and the Joker and all that stuff, and Batman, from down in the bottom of the wheel, government, right, ruling over mankind in this, like a guard, or having charge over us who really are the heirs. So it's all, all the fairy tales, all the stories and the movies and the scriptures and everything is relating and talking about all of this. So in the longer view, it isn't 1,260 years. Remember, it goes from 3.5 actual years to a day for a year, 1,260 years. And in the greater fulfillment, it's 12,600. And 2 of those, to make 7 times, would be 2,500 or 25,200. The entire wheel. But we're just going to take it for this one little sample, this one fulfillment. We know that in some way or another, when the book of Revelation is talking about the woman, and she says she's clothed with the sun, she's crowned with 12 stars, and the moon is beneath her feet, at that point she's got to be above Aries, because the moon is down in the night, and the sun is on a crown, she's clothed with the sun. So the woman who goes through the great, wilderness and wanders around to the desert like, with Moses, she finally comes out with this, not with the moon of the law, right, ruling over her, but that's under her feet. That's the darkness. Now she's crowned. She's got a crown of 12 stars. She's conquered the zodiac, and she's clothed with the sun. So now she gives birth to a child, which is Jesus. So we know that has to happen after Christ, not before. These are ways that we can understand all of these symbolisms, but it's very intricate and detailed. So the 1,260 days would be 1,260 years from 800 to 2060. And the 2,300 evenings and mornings, or days, and the reason it says evenings and mornings there is because it's talking about the evening and morning sacrifices. So it's specifically talking not just about any old day, but about days that we're going to be missing the true sacrifice. The evening and morning oblations. And it will be trampled on by the nations. And so that's just a symbolism to show you what it's all about. So it says it will begin with the going forth of the call to restore and build Jerusalem, which we know then was about 450, 460 BC. And it ends then when? About 1844. And then it says the hour of the judgment has arrived. And there's several places where it talks about, it says, the 10 kings, they shall receive power 1 hour with the beast. Well, so that particular hour where these 10 kings finally receive a kingdom has to be the same period of time that Babylon has fallen, because she receives her judgment in 1 hour. What could the hour be? Well, what does the 10 kings do? It says he puts it into their mind and into their heart to carry out this one wish, this one thing, and that is that they shall devour her flesh and eat her up and devour her and destroy her, because the hour of her judgment has come. So the last period of time, which is just an hour, a small little period of time, we're going to find out what that is, which is going to pinpoint the date. That little hour is the last hour that we're told, get out of her, my people. You don't want to share with her in her errors, because it's her hour of judgment. And the angel blows his trumpet and says, fear God and keep his commandments. These are those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. The ones who receive the seal of God in their forehead. The others are receiving the mark of the beast. And the angels are going forth and separating the sheep from the goats. It's a time of judgment. How long would that time of judgment be? This is where people have never understood that this is a long historical period. And it's not going to necessarily be just a year or a day. It's history. The Bible's describing history to you. So if a day is 2,520 years, remember, the day of the Lord doesn't represent a 24-hour day. The word yom in Hebrew can mean a period of any kind, but it usually refers something like a day or summer or something, a period of time such as the day. Well, if the day of the Lord is 2,520 years, then 1 hour would be 210. And if Babylon fell in 1844, and you add 210 years, you come out to right around 2060. Because we don't know the day and the hour. Remember, we're not getting the exact dates in this. This is just a general thing. We'll talk about more definitely in other videos. We'll scrutinize these dates a little bit more. But I just want to give you a little general idea. So, 1844, the people were looking for the end of the world, but it didn't happen. But what did happen? Well, the end of the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. This was the time when America was coming along, and we were getting these. Remember what we talked about yesterday? We were getting these constitutions. The light was beginning to shine. Her judgment was coming. And what is the judgment? The judgment is upon the whore and all the people who don't want to receive the love of the truth that they might be saved. So they what? So they get the strong delusion. And that's why the angel says, get out of her, my people, if you don't want to share. Oh, it's a time of reckoning. It's a time of light. It's a time of separating the sheep from the goats. It's a time when people shall go forth and this good news of the kingdom shall be preached. And the angel shall sound forth his voice. Well, I didn't hear no angel, Dave. Yes, you did. The Constitution and the bell of liberty has been ringing. Haven't you heard it? Guess what? We passed laws, universal laws and constitutions of inalienable rights that women can vote now. Slavery has been abolished throughout the entire world. At least legally, it's illegal. Whereas before it was part of the law. But that old system's gone. The light is shining. The bell is ringing. My friends, judgment, the sound of the third angel's message is going forth, and it's not being done by Ellen White. Although she helped to explain some of these things. Because we've had many people that have tried to explain these things. Even Charles Taze Russell, who said that, maybe it would be 1914. Well, he tried to explain a lot of this stuff, which generally was kind of in the same, vein as some of the Adventists and the Millerites and Sir Isaac Newton and others. They just got a few of these points. I mean, Hal Lindsey, he understood that we were living in the time of the end. He just didn't have the correct day and the hour. Nobody really figured this out because it wasn't time yet. So that last 210 years is the hour of judgment. The hour that the 10 kings devour the woman that rides this beast, which is Babylon. And the power, the temporal power of Rome was actually, Napoleon Bonaparte took that away, and I think it was 1808. Was it 1809? He said, well, wait a minute, you said it was 1844. Well, remember, the 1,290 days ended in 1844, according to Sir Isaac Newton. And that was the end of World War II. And right after that, they started going back to their land. We don't know the day and the hour, but it certainly does seem to fit. Now, we know the Holy Roman Empire started in 800. I mean, you could maybe say, well, they did little thing over here in 1780, or maybe that's when it was. Okay, but it's right about that time. And we know that the temporal power of the Holy Roman Empire ended in 1808, and the Constitution came about in 1776 and 1791, and the French Constitution, and the light began to shine. We know that it was right around 1830. The Mormons say it was 1830. Joseph Smith came along and he sent certain ones over to Israel at that time. Before there was ever an Israel. In the early 1800s, around 1830, Joseph Smith sent individuals over there and prayed that that land would be returned back to Israel. Remember, Israel is not just one tribe called the Judeans, but it's the 10 lost tribes are all over the world. It's all of us. And it's the restoration of the holy sanctuary, and we're all part of that sanctuary. The 140 and 4,000 is 12,000 from each of the tribes, and those tribes are in all the world, and it includes all of us. And we're all being gathered to the true holy sanctuary, which is in heaven. Remember that movie? I don't know if you remember it. I don't watch a lot of movies like this, but I remember, years ago, somehow or another, this movie was on called The Omen, or Omen 2, or whatever. I don't remember which one it was, but it was really, really an awful movie. But I remember sitting there watching it, and this was years ago. And I remember in this movie, the Antichrist was actually born of a woman on earth. And the Antichrist is born, or the man of perdition, right? And he's born into this world, and he's going out because he thinks he's going to conquer Jesus. And he's going to go try and find the coming of the Lord Jesus, his second coming. He's trying to find who gave birth to Jesus, because he's born in the flesh. He's thinking, okay, Jesus must be here somewhere. And he looks and he looks and he searches and he can't find Jesus. And he almost wins and takes over the world. And then all of a sudden, Jesus arrives in his glory, in this bright, shining light, because Jesus is not a flesh-born person anymore. Jesus is resurrected, and he's in heaven, and he's sitting at the right hand of God. And he has cleansed that sanctuary, my friend, which is your heart. And that's where these decisions are being made, in our heart. So I'm just giving you a general idea of why we generally understand that these dates and these figures are as we're saying. Now, we haven't proven any of it in this video. Many of you might say, oh, Dave, you didn't prove any of that. I don't know what you're talking about. Well, you see, it would be difficult to prove each and every one of these little dates and figures. And, we don't know the day and the hour. We know this is prophecy. Remember, in the days of Jesus, they were looking for the Messiah. They say, who do you say I am? Well, some say you're Jeremiah. Some say you're Elijah. Some say you're, the Messiah. We're looking for the Messiah. Who? Are you the Messiah? The one that was prophesied? They knew it was about time, and they were looking for him. You never know exactly when something's going to happen. You just know it's prophesied, and you know it's about time. And that's the way it was then. That's the way it's going to be now. The day and the hour knoweth no man. But the book of Revelation talks about a specific day and month and year and hour. It's all destined. The very day, the very year, the very month, and the very hour. That hour is a 210-year period. And that day is a period of 2,520 years. There's a grand scheme, a grand calendar that we haven't even scratched the surface of understanding all of these dates. It's an intricate system that we're going to delve into over the next many videos. But we've got to prove one point at a time. And so I just want to show generally in this video the basic outline of why we understand that these beasts came up, what they generally mean, what these 10 horns generally mean, and how we're going to go through this last long little period. For us, it's going to be a long period. The hour of his judgment. The hour when the 10 kings devour her flesh and eat up her flesh. And Babylon is fallen. And we have this period in history where we're seeing truth shining and the sanctuary being cleansed, and having then to go and make a decision whether we want to go up, under the Lord's house because the time is at hand, or whether we're going to be obstinate. Are we going to be, trying to get into the wedding without our wedding garment? These are the days that we live in, where all of these parables can be understood, so that we understand not just some little parable in a book, some little moral lesson, but so that we can understand that there's something we have to do. It's not about getting some laundry soap and washing our clothes. It's not about keeping ceremonies and laws. It's not about a literal temple. Now, the devil, the Antichrist, when he's born, because Jesus said, I've come in my Father's name, you rejected me. But when he comes in his own name, him ye shall receive. And they will build a temple for him, and he will enter into it and declare himself God. And many there will be who will receive him. But Jesus is in heaven. And he will consume him by the power of his strength and his light and his love. So, anyway, I'm going to go ahead and go. It's been about an hour. I hope, that made sense, because I'm just trying to generally put it together a little bit, and then we're going to go into it in more in-depth study as we go. Perhaps we'll do this a couple of times just to kind of throw some things out there to kind of generally get us so we're on the right track, so we grasp the whole general thing. And then once we kind of realize that this is the main outline, then we can pinpoint some of these dates and prophecies and kings and these, specific things that's going on in our day. Anyway, I'm David Vos. I hope you guys have a really great day. Stay warm. We'll see you again tomorrow. Have a good one.